A warm welcome to you, everybody, to this Dun & Bradstreet webinar on the evolving tariff landscape. So this is for many of us inside and outside of the US, a very relevant topic. So I'm Mikael Osmar. I'm heading the business advisory team in Northern Europe in Dun & Bradstreet. So being a global data provider, Dun & Bradstreet gets a lot of questions and asks when a world order gets disrupted. So that goes for global pandemics, that goes for larger conflicts, and now global trade and tariffs. So currently, we're all working to understand the effects of the tariffs during the cooling off period and beyond. Also, many of us are looking for ways to handle this instability. So with us today from locations all over Europe, we will cover 3 areas. So it's about the first one, about understanding the macroeconomic landscape and key challenges. So we have Grant Hickson, economist in Dun & Bradstreet's London office, that will give us the perspectives on how the tariffs are impacting the economy. Then we have about the second one, about understanding exposure and hidden risks across our customers and our supply chains. This is somewhat of our main course of today. This is brought to us by Theodora Papadimitropoulou, our third-party risk and compliance specialist. Theo was recently named the Compliance Person of the Year in Sweden. So it's very nice to have you with us today from Stockholm, Theo.
Thank you, Mark.
The third area we will cover is about strategies to grow in times of uncertainty. So this is covered to you by Thomas Mavroudis, specializing in sales and marketing solutions from our Frankfurt office. And we will open up for questions after Thomas's presentations in Q&A. So please write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen during the presentations, and we will pick them up at the end of this webinar. So before I hand over to our speakers, I have one question poll as a bit of a pulse check about how we are currently, how we are able to handle the tariffs. I hope you see the poll on your screens now. So the question is, what factors are currently limiting your ability to effectively respond to the impact of tariffs? So multiple choice question here. So 5 alternatives here: influencing decision makers, access to reliable data to understand risks, turning data into actionable insights, defining clear steps to navigate uncertainty, and organizational apathy. So let's see what we get here in terms of answers. I have support from Jan to handle the results. Are we shifting to results? Okay. Not much organizational apathy there. Great. But other very interesting insights on this, of course, quite widespread there. Let's see if we, many thanks for your contribution to this poll check. Let's see if we can pick this up and mention this in the presentations following. So with that, I'm handing over to London and to Grant for the macroeconomic perspective on this topic. The stage is yours, Grant.
Thank you, Michael. Interesting that 2 of the highest scoring answers there were understanding data and navigating uncertainty. And I think those are certainly key themes in today's presentation. I'll be exploring the macroeconomic context of recent tariffs on businesses. The central theme, of course, is highly active policymaking, especially in trade. It feels to me like we're at a point of inflection. We know what global trade looked like before. It's far less clear, at least to me, what we're inflecting towards. What will be the mix of the old and the new? Tariffs are now being used not just to protect critical industries or respond to perceived unfair practices, they're also shaping global supply chains. And that reconfiguration is both a policy goal and a reaction to shifting alliances. So these tariffs are altering cost structures, changing capital allocation, and introducing new forms of economic risk. And at the same time, they're creating opportunities. And understanding this evolving landscape is essential for maintaining business resilience, competitiveness, and long-term strategy. But assessing the business impacts of tariffs is getting harder. So companies face a dual challenge, making smart strategic decisions while analysing increasingly ambiguous cost implications, and all under extraordinary uncertainty. So I group these challenges into two core issues: strategic uncertainty and analytical complexity. And starting with strategic uncertainty, I think many recent tariffs have been introduced abruptly with no clear timelines, without knowing whether they'll be short-lived or expanded. So it's incredibly difficult for businesses to plan with confidence. And firms are now rerouting supply chains in real time to mitigate risk. But these shifts bring their own complications, higher logistical costs, new compliance requirements, operational disruptions. On the analytical side, pass-through effects are hard to trace. So tariffs may increase costs, but those costs are absorbed unevenly across suppliers, wholesalers, and retailers. And modelling these effects is difficult, especially when data lags by quarters. So we also face a policy lag. And by that, I mean, by the time we see cost changes in earnings or inventory, the policy environment may have already shifted again. So there's this time inconsistency problem associated with the policy and observable effects. We can move on to the next slide, please, Jan. So to deal with this uncertainty, we've developed a framework to help assess risk. And we've called this the Tariff Vulnerability Score, or TVS for short. It's built around 4 core data dimensions, which we integrate into a single risk index. So first, the change in US tariffs adjusted for exemptions. Higher effective tariffs translate directly to higher vulnerability, especially if suppliers can't easily pass on costs or if substitution is a threat. Second, US market exposure, and this captures how dependent a product is on the US as an export market, and greater reliance means higher exposure to US tariffs. Third, global growth for the product. So this helps identify alternative markets. Higher global growth suggests exporters have more options, which can help mitigate risk. And fourth, import concentration in the US. And this data set assesses how concentrated the US import base is for each product. And if there's only a few countries that dominate supply, then country X enjoys relatively more pricing power. And when we combine these variables into a single score, we get a clearer view of where risks are concentrated and which products or sectors are most exposed. So on the next slide, please, Jan, we can look at how this plays out in real markets. So here I've mapped Germany's average TVS for key exports on the y-axis and overall export value on the x-axis. The products in the upper left quadrant, so that's high vulnerability but lower export value, are at most immediate risk. And this pattern holds across countries like Sweden, the UK, and India. If we move right on the chart towards higher export value, we see motor vehicles and machinery. So these are economically significant, but with moderate tariff risk at the moment. So take a mid-sized German car, like a BMW 3 Series or a VW Golf. They have high TVS because of direct US competition from Ford Mustangs or Dodge Chargers. There's similar dynamics in the UK, where a large share of luxury vehicle exports, so Bentleys, Aston Martins, go to the US, and in Sweden, where the auto industry underpins the economy. For India, high vulnerability products include nuclear-related equipment like generators and industrial boilers, sectors where the US is a critical destination. On the next slide, please, Jan. So the key question is, where do we go from here? What happens next? Well, that depends, I think, on several developments. And I'll wrap up this part of the webinar with 6 forward-looking considerations. The first of which is strategic tariff expansion. We may see new tariffs targeting semiconductors, AI, or pharmaceuticals. I think what's happened so far has been policy activity that addresses primary areas of trade concern. And what may happen next is those secondary or tertiary priorities. Further rounds of tit-for-tat tariffs are likely, a tightening of the Gordian knot, if you like. And this may also, in some form, include more subtle barriers, such as those to shape trade flows like subsidies, regulations, standards. And a corollary of that could see the formation of regional trade alliances that bypass tariffs and strengthen those regional supply chains. I think logistical diversification is a consideration. Companies are already rethinking distribution, reshoring production, investing closer to home, especially where attractive subsidies are available or national interests are at stake. I think we may see more of that. I think the fifth is that, of course, as the focus shifts from global efficiency to strategic independence, we'll see uneven winners and losers, both across and within sectors. And a final point, I think this fragmentation or reshaping of risks, risk escalation to a broader trade war, or spilling into other areas. So trade conflict in whatever shape could morph into currency tensions, capital flow restrictions, or technology bans, which could create all sorts of instability, not least amongst financial service providers. So just to bring my section to a close, I'll summarize. We are seemingly moving towards a more fragmented and strategic trade environment. It's not immediately clear what that will look like. I think tariffs today are less about competition and more about economic security and geopolitical leverage. I think while some industries may benefit in the short term, the macroeconomic uncertainty remains significant and for some businesses debilitating. But understanding possibilities and prospects is absolutely critical for navigating what's next. And with that, I'll hand over to Theo to take us deeper into those risks.
Great. Thank you for that macro perspective, Grant. Very interesting to hear. And certainly it comes as no surprise that the shift in the current tariff policy environment is a strong reminder and reinforcement that volatility and disruption are here to stay and are impacting our value chain. So both on the customer side, but also on the supply side. And these policy changes, to some extent, are really pushing the button in terms of bringing with them some profound challenges for organizations to manage and navigate, especially for international businesses across the globe. But it also highlights the importance of understanding not only the risks that are very apparent, such as the cost aspect, how the divergence will actually affect both customers and suppliers from a cost perspective, but it also brings urgency to understanding and highlighting the importance of building end-to-end resilience and holistic risk management practices. And risk is certainly not binary, so it tends to be multifaceted, especially when it comes to managing third-party risk. And as you can see from this picture here, there are a number of impacts and implications off the back of these tariffs, and most of them are quite hidden, and they also bring some further unintended consequences to the broader landscape of how we manage regulatory compliance risks more broadly. So just to give a couple of examples, as companies look to diverge their supplier bases, they'll be looking at potentially bringing back production facilities to the US, but they'll also be looking at alternative routes and possibly jurisdictions that are typically found in free trade zones. And most of the jurisdictions that are listed under the free trade zone environment, in essence, are third countries, which bring additional risks to our ESG and governance framework. So organizations need to be also thinking about what are the additional environmental challenges that organizations may face, but also some of the ethical standards, such as will our risks, for example, within modern slavery increase as a result of that. We can also anticipate that some level of interaction with risks associated to the potential circumvention of tariffs, with goods leaving certain jurisdictions but actually being produced in other countries. And that has a twofold effect on not only the tariff circumvention, but also risks that may be associated to sanction circumvention, for example, especially when it's becoming increasingly difficult to get access to certain components. Grant mentioned before the fact around semiconductors, but also other critical components such as batteries and drones, for example, that also impact critical infrastructure. So I think a few considerations here is not only to consider what is the direct liability, but what is the indirect liability that's going to impact our value chains, and what regulatory requirements and governance standards do we need to be thinking about to move towards more proactive risk management practices. Next slide, please. So if we take a deeper look into some of the consequences, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we have a couple of examples of organizations that are producing incremental critical infrastructure material to certain defense around the globe. And we can see that they have been impacted by the responses from some of the jurisdictions, specifically coming from China, where China has restricted some raw components and materials going to critical infrastructure providers. And this has a domino effect into how goods are being sourced out to jurisdictions, not only from a critical infrastructure perspective, creating delays to the US defense, but also creating additional shortages and implications to other EU defense organizations as well. We also saw that, I think, a couple of years ago, off the back of the 2018 shift, Apple had shifted some of the production into Vietnam from China. And as a result, some of their environmental priorities were impacted. And we also saw, I believe, in the 2024 annual report that temporarily the scope 3 emissions had been impacted. So it's important to think about risk as multifaceted and not binary, and also to understand what underlying risks could be occurring further down in the chain as a consequence of these supplies shifting into other jurisdictions and diversifying their supplier bases. Next slide, please. So let's take a closer look at some of the implications that these reciprocal tariffs could have on supply chains. There was a survey commissioned here in Sweden by the Central Bank of Sweden that primarily asked manufacturing companies around their concern of the direct impacts of the tariffs, primarily from a cost perspective. And as you can see from the diagram to the far left, the vast majority of Swedish manufacturing organizations were not too concerned about the direct impact and implications on their value chain. But on the diagram to the right, you can certainly see that the vast majority of recipients did respond that they were concerned about the implication that these indirect consequences that could affect their supply chains, specifically understanding how critical raw material suppliers would be impacted off the back of this tariff shift in policy, especially further down the supply chain. So looking at their NT suppliers, most organizations don't really have a very transparent view over who their NT suppliers are. And this is also confirmed and illustrated by the illustration here to the right, where we can see that in this picture, we can see an order supply chain manufacturing moving from several jurisdictions, passing the US several times before the final end product is assembled out to the to the end client. So we can see that there could be a double materiality impact as well as the final goods get shipped out to the clients. Next slide, please. So what should organizations be looking at in terms of mitigating some of that supply chain risk, both in terms of their existing network, so their existing suppliers, but also as they look to diverge and onboard new and alternative suppliers? A robust supplier due diligence program should be intact in order to build these resilient networks, and achieving transparency across the value chain and understanding the risk that is associated not only to the direct suppliers, but also their counterparts. Remember that these tariffs are not only impacting our direct trade relationships, but they're impacting our customers' trade relationships and our suppliers' trade relationships. So increasingly important to assess not only the financial health of these businesses, but also to understand the material impact that divergence of certain geopolitical situations will bring to the risk assessment, and to ensure that these entities are being thoroughly monitored through data and analytics to help support more of the holistic integrated risk management process. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So what are the steps that our customers are looking at? We've been discussing the tariff situation with many companies across Europe, and the messaging has been more or less the same. They are concerned about the direct exposure. So the first initial step that they're looking at in the immediate short term is to understand the exposure across their value chains and understand the criticality of what risks are important to them. So in some cases, financial risk will definitely be the most important aspect, but in other situations, organizations will be heavily impacted by these underlying hidden risks, and they need to perform an impact assessment to understand what risks they need to prioritize and what risk will have the most immediate impact on their businesses. So proportionate risk is going to be an absolute priority for organizations, as most organizations are also typically looking at a risk-based approach. It's becoming increasingly difficult to rely only on let's say your direct customers or your direct suppliers. So having that initial impact analysis done is going to be one of the immediate priorities of organizations, and implementing proactive monitoring capabilities to be able to track incremental changes to risk profiles. So gaining access in real time to reliable data coming from a variety of sources. So multi-sourcing strategy will also be critical for customers across jurisdictions to have a hold on. In the more longer term priorities are really around reducing the dependencies across these suppliers and customers, and sourcing alternative suppliers where feasible, and really understanding not only the opportunity around where these suppliers could be sourced, but also understanding the challenges that may come along with that. So understanding dependencies on ownership, for example, and what types of risks these ownership structures could also bring to organizations, and really moving forward with accelerating their digital transformation strategies, looking at deploying artificial intelligence more long-term. But again, artificial intelligence brings with it a lot of challenges in terms of trust and ethical sort of responsibility. So what data can we trust? How do we source that data? Is it reliable? And how do we make that data ethical? And then use data and analytics to really power that transformation internally. And last but not least, proactively act across the organization in a holistic manner to support a more informed decision-making across the board. Thank you. I'll hand it over to the next speaker. So, Thomas.
Thanks, Theodora, and good morning also from my side. So my part is all about how you can understand your customer exposure and how you can identify the opportunities, even in the landscape of tariffs. I have 4 steps you should follow to be successful and to extend really your business or save your business and grow your business. So the first step is to understand, first of all, what is your exposure, but also you need to understand what is the exposure of your customers. Once you have done this, the next step is you need to define your ideal customer portfolio, because you need to know which customers you are doing really the best business, because the next step is you need to identify exactly the same, the good customers you have in new markets, meaning either in markets you are not acting at the moment, but also in markets you are acting, so you can really focusing your sales that are successful in finding so-called lookalikes. And the 4th step, Theodora mentioned it already also, you need to take the advantage of increasing the efficiency of sales. You need to automate your sales, and you need also to use capabilities that are modern and state-of-the-art to really increase the efficiency. So the next slide, when I'm talking about understand your customers and the exposure of your customers, what you need to do, it's not only have one-dimensional, what customers do I have, for example, in the US, but what is the associated revenue with this, to have really your exposure you have. In the next step, you need definitely to see, okay, which customers of mine are very strong in affected countries like the US. Which of these customers are in risk? You need to identify them. And like in the graph on the right-hand side, you need also to identify the customers in your portfolio that are interconnected to each other. So because it's important, if one customer is affected, potentially this will affect other companies that are in this family tree, in this group, and this will definitely have also impact to your business with your customers. In the next slide, you will see that how you should define your ideal customer portfolio. So let's say traditionally, it's industry and revenue and employee count, but what we are also recommending, let's say picking up what I said in my second slide, the corporate structure is very important. By using the corporate structure, you can identify companies for cross and upsell opportunities with existing business you are doing with group companies already. So this is very important, but also you need to know, or you need to take into equation the more modern sources, like what is the content on the websites these companies are talking, what kind of certifications, as an example, they have, what kind of technologies they use, either on their website, but also in their production processes or in their supply chain. So these are, let's say, important things you need to take into account when you define your ideal customer portfolio. And once you have defined and you understand your customers and you say, these are my A customers, I need to know them and I need to find similar customers like that. So in the next slide, you have the information that, first of all, before joining a market, you need to evaluate the market in terms of stability, and in terms of economic stability, but also trade environment. So which markets you want to enter, you see the potential, you need to assess their, let's say, your risk, but also your opportunities. And here again, I would like also to mention that you need to identify the companies that are part of an existing business you're doing, the corporate family structure. And based on the ideal customer portfolio, obviously, not only in new markets you will have identified the lookalikes, but also you need to extend your business with companies you are already in business with, or in markets you're already in business with. And so you will have, let's say, a solid foundation. You can still grow your business. In the next slide, I'm closing my part and telling you that the ways how you need to increase your efficiency, because at the end, you should take this opportunity to really focus your sales, to really find the lookalikes we have defined at the beginning. What do I mean by increase the efficiency of your sales and marketing departments? Theodora mentioned that already. There are a lot of AI capabilities in the meanwhile available that can use either your CRM systems, either third-party products, and that brings a lot of value to your sales. Then you need to identify and prioritize your in-market buyers. What does this mean? There are different technologies and analytics where you are able to identify companies based on their behavior, on their consumption behavior in the internet, on what topics they are interested, called intent data. Once you have identified the companies that are interested in the related topics your products are offering or your services you're offering, then you are able to focus your sales that they can really attract first these kind of customers. And then the also very obvious thing is everyone is digital in our times, and what you need to do is to ensure that you can identify the visitors on your website, depending on which country they are. If you are able to identify the visitors on your website, and if the visitors are fitting to your ideal customer portfolio, it's really an increased efficiency by your sales, because you can focus and prioritize these customers at the beginning. And last but not least, obviously, you need also to use so-called news triggers. So because our world is very digital, and within news, you can derive information that are relevant for your customer portfolio, but also for your opportunities. And there are also automated ways you can use it, called triggers, news triggers, where your sales can be informed and can act based on the information they receive every day. So by having this said, I will hand over to Michael, and I'm looking forward for any questions.
Thank you very much, Theo, Grant, and Thomas, for your presentations. I'm picking up quite a few things here. So from Grant, for example, zooming out to understand how the risks are spread with the vulnerability index, the amount of risks that are hidden, and the indirect liabilities from Theodora's presentation, and from Thomas's last presentation here, the use of modern sales and marketing capabilities. These are times to use those for sure. So thanks a lot to our speakers. So we're now stepping in to the Q&A. So we'll take care of your questions coming in. Please stay with us here to the end, because we will have an attractive proposition for you guys to help you to better understand your supply chain risks. So stay tuned for that at the end. So let's open up for questions from the live audience. With us on this Q&A, in addition to our three speakers, we have Ravi Sidhu. Maybe you can wave to the camera, Ravi, our subject matter expert in credit and finance. And we have Christian Kellner as well on the supplier solutions topic available for us here. So if I may start, this is a question, I think, for you, Ravi. Sure. Are there specific data sources or indicators that you recommend tracking for early signals of trade disruptions?
Yeah, so I guess just to reiterate before we jump into that question, I think it's really important in terms of what we've mentioned so far around the risk-based approach. Whether it's the tariff volatility score, shipping insights, or any detailed analytics we can provide, initially segmenting the portfolio and then applying the overlay of data sources that we have. And so for some of our customers, they may be familiar with our traditional scores, so the failure score and the delinquency score, so probability of failure within the next 12 months or delinquency in the next 12 months. But I think it needs to go deeper than that. So you will have underlying data attributes. So whether it's alerts from financials, whether it's information from our trade credit file, you're looking for any kind of movement. So it's not just negative movements in payments. You might actually start seeing some positive movements because people want to hold on to certain credit lines because it's more important. So just looking out for those changes is going to be one of the really key things, I think. And over and above that, within each market, there will be specific data sets that will be very useful that maybe you haven't considered using in the past. So as an example, in the UK, we have SME scores and SME data from CCDS data. And that's where you can use information from the credit use case. And the reason why I highlight that is because it gives you visibility on the current account for SMEs in the UK, as an example. And it's more illustrative because you can actually look at what's happening in a more real-time way. And that's very, very important in the current circumstances. So hopefully that kind of outlines the approach. And from the poll that we had earlier on, I think the data understanding and actionable next steps, these are probably the things that we would allude to. Thanks, Miguel.
And thanks, Ravi. So the next question is for you, Christian. Based on prior supply chain disruptions that we've experienced over the past 5 years, what steps have proven most helpful for building resilience in these times of volatility?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Michael. It's interesting because it's disruptions are different, but the learnings and takeaways are similar in most cases. And I think with my data lenses on, given that reply, I think it boils down to really 3 aspects or best practices. And I think we've touched on a couple of those already through the comments from Theo and Ravi. Is around implementing a data-driven, standardized, risk-based approach to assess risks in a standardized way associated with your business partners. I think that's the most critical piece. So first of all, get that in place and make sure that the supplier base and business partner base is cleaned up, and that, of course, all that you will reflect in those processes and this risk-based approach is properly reflected and is well communicated in policies that are spread throughout the organization. I think that's critical. Start with the critical suppliers, critical customers, get those in first, as Theo mentioned already in her presentation, and build up from there while continuously monitor changes within your business partner base. Specifically as well, calling out on what Ravi has pointed out. Secondly, I think it's around getting visibility into beyond tier 1 suppliers. That is crucial. Leverage data that is out there. Is it either public data, trade data, our shipping asset, for instance, or questionnaires you're sending out to your suppliers to understand deeper supply chain dependencies, being it critical suppliers with exposure to high-risk countries or nexus suppliers with relationships into numerous suppliers, sub-suppliers, or simply suppliers that, have significant dependencies on higher risk markets, as we currently see it, with the topic at hand with the US tariffs piece. And I think finally it's around learning and taking away that strategic sourcing and identifying alternative suppliers is critical using advanced technologies. And I think Thomas made a great point earlier around identifying new customers, new markets, but I think the same principles apply as well to your suppliers and upstream, diversifying your supply chain. So I think it's really those 3 things: data-driven, standardized, risk-based approach, visibility beyond tier 1, and expand and diversify your supply chain.
Thanks a lot, Christian, for your answers on that one. So the next one, I think, is for you, Grant. In macro terms, what happens following the 90-day tariff pause, and where is the TVS score available?
Right. Okay. So taking the second question first, if I may. So the TVS score is currently, we've used that in white paper analysis, and those white papers are being published. So check there. And then I think get in contact with us on the country insights page through Dun & Bradstreet, and we can talk about developing that for potentially other countries. It's possible we can recreate that for other countries where data are available. On the 90-day pause, I think this is a good question. I think it ties into some of the broader dynamics I talked about earlier at the end of my section. But I think we can look at it probably in more specific terms. Firstly, and I think, broadly speaking, the way I see it is the way ahead can, to a degree, be sort of visualized as a sort of spectrum of outcomes. And I think in that sense, there are probably five or six plausible scenarios. I think the first of which, at one end of that spectrum, is a sort of negotiated resolution. So the pause, I think, creates space for diplomacy. And I think that's what we've seen. Some countries have been seeking to reach a deal. I think if negotiations go well, we could see a revision of trade terms. Potentially that might lead to reduced or even eliminated tariffs. That would signal de-escalation. That perhaps brings some stability to markets again. We may see tariff reinstatement. I think if talks stall or break down even, then tariffs may be reinstated or even expanded. That would likely reignite market volatility. It would certainly elevate trade tensions. There would be, again, knock-on effects across supply chains. Another possibility is an extension of the pause. If progress is made, but more time is needed, then we could see an extension there. I think that scenario is a little bit ambiguous in terms of its reaction in markets. Markets might interpret that as a positive sign of ongoing engagement, or alternatively, it could be seen as continued uncertainty. So that one's not really clear. I think the one that does have legs is sector-specific compromises, so targeted or selective tariffs. Certain goods or industries are affected. That would produce uneven impacts, and there would certainly be winners and losers with that one. And then finally, I think right at the other end of the kind of spectrum I'm sort of sketching out here is countries may respond with retaliatory measures, as we have seen already, including tariffs, export controls, regulatory barriers. And that would potentially push the dispute beyond tariffs into a more broader economic confrontation. Where do I sort of land in that kind of spectrum? I think probably some kind of hybrid, some movement towards a framework of negotiated exemptions, bilateral deals. And, some markets or countries are probably better able to negotiate than others, depending on the relative strength or sort of incentive to retaliate.
Thanks very much, Grant. So that was the last question for today. So before we're wrapping up, we have one more question for you guys in the poll. If you can bring that up, Jan, please, in a bit of a hurry before we end. So we're very interested in hearing what your wishes are when it comes to topics for upcoming events and webinars. So if we please could have your interest in these questions. Or on these alternatives: macroeconomic insights relating to tariffs, uncovering and mitigating risk in your customer supply chain, developing new markets, or highlighting areas of opportunity. I don't know if we can show the results or if we still have results coming in. Probably we have. Okay. So hidden, uncovering and mitigating risk in your customers and supply chain. Very interesting. Thanks a lot for that, everybody. So if we go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned before, in terms of what you can do next. So if you're interested in uncovering potential tariff exposure within your supply chain, you can reach out to us on this email address, hello@dnb.com, or you can reach out to us via the follow-up link, which you will receive after this event, where you can request a complimentary supply chain evaluation to provide a view of the impact from proposed tariffs on businesses' supply chain. So that's very, very interesting. So to take a look at that and have your eyes open for the link coming from this webinar. Of course, if there's anything else, reach out to your account team at Dun & Bradstreet, or again at the email address at the bottom of this slide, hello@dnb.com. So thank you all very much for attending this webinar. Very, very pleased to have so many of us listening to this important topic. The links to this recorded session, this webinar, will be provided to you via email. So stay tuned for more webinars and more content on this topic from Dun & Bradstreet. So with that being said, wishing you all a great day, and thanks. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.